Hi, this is Diversity of Life, Investigation 7 vocabulary, and all of this vocab has to do with flowering plants, or parts of a flower. So we're going to talk about all of these flower parts in this vocab. A pistil is the female part of the flower. So this entire yellow thing here is the pistil, and that's the female part. Stigma, which is one part of the pistil, is this sticky part of the flower. This is called the stigma. So many different shapes and sizes of stigmas. Here's one in a lily plant. This one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different stigmas. This is a hibiscus. And you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different stigmas in this flower, and that flower comes from a cactus. So stigma, sticky. Try to remember that. Stigma is the sticky part. The style is like a style that you would use like on your phone, long and skinny. It connects the stigma to the ovary. So this part here, the skinny part, is the style. And another part to the pistil is the ovary. The ovary is where seeds develop in a flower. So you can have petals that are attached above the ovary, or they're attached around the ovary, or the parts of the flower can be attached below the ovary. You'll see all different kinds of ovary positions when you look at flowers. But the ovary is where the seeds develop. Ovules are eggs, the female sex cell. They're the tiny pre-seeds, or eggs, that are inside of the ovary. So here's a cross-section of an ovary. So this whole thing here is the ovary, and these little things here are the ovules, which contain the eggs. And this particular picture of ovules is from a flower called a narcissus. Stamen. Now we're talking about the male part of the flower. The male part of the flower is the stamen. So this structure, this structure, this structure, and this structure. So in this particular flower, you have both the female parts, the pistil, and the male parts, the stamen. Some flowers will have just male parts. Some flowers will have just female parts. But when they have both, it's called a perfect flower. So now we're going to talk about the male parts, the stamen. The stamen consists of anthers. So here is the anthers in this real picture, and here is the anther in the drawing. The definition of an anther is it produces the pollen grains. The anther produces the pollen grains, and you can see the little yellow orangish pollen grains all over these anthers. Here's your pistil running down the middle. That's the female part. The filament is simply the stalk of the anther. It holds it up. So, quite long filaments on this male stamen. Pollen grain. Pollen grains hold the sperm cell of a flower. So you can see all of the pollen grains on here, that kind of orange fuzzy look to it. You could take a microscope and look inside. You would see that there is a sperm cell inside of the pollen grain. Here's a real picture under a microscope of a whole bunch of pollen grains that have landed on a sticky stigma. That's why it's sticky, so that the pollen grains can stick to it. And this is of a hibiscus. So those of you that have allergies in the spring, summer, fall, whatever, a lot of times your allergies are to certain pollens that plants give off. The sperm that is inside the pollen is the male sex cell. So it's the ovule or the egg in the female part, and it's the sperm in the male part. The male sex cell found in the pollen grain. So I've kind of made this bigger so it's fuzzy, but here's your pollen grain, and inside you have a sperm that will grow a pollen tube, and the sperm will travel down it. What is a pollen tube? A pollen tube is where the pollen grain germinates and grows the length of the pistil. So have the pollen grain that lands on the stigma, and there's the pollen has 2 cells in it, and the one cell germinates and makes a tube down the style and all the way down into the ovary. Once it's made that tube, then the sperm, will travel down that tube so it can get to the egg. So a pollen tube is literally a tube that is formed down the style and into the ovary of the female part. Pollination is the process by which pollen goes from one anther to the pistil. Pollination is when the pollen has to get to the stigma somehow. So here's a picture of some pollen grains that have landed on a stigma. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 parts to this stigma. You can see all the pollen grains on it. That's pollination. How does that happen? It can happen abiotically. In other words, wind and water can get the pollen onto the stigma, or it can happen biotically, which is animals. Birds, insects, bats, people, anything can transfer pollen from the anther onto the pistil or the stigma. That's pollination. Fertilization is a little bit more complex. Once pollination has occurred, then fertilization can happen, and that's when the egg and sperm are joined. So here you have pollen that landed on the stigma. The pollen grows a pollen tube. Once the tube is grown, then the sperm travels down that tube and it unites with the ovules in here. And once that happens, then this can start to form a fruit or a nut or a seed of some kind. That's fertilization. Sexual reproduction is fertilization, when the female sex cell and the male sex cell merge to form a new plant. That's why we call it sexual reproduction. The sperm and the egg have to unite. Sperm travels down, unites with the egg, and now you start to get the endosperm, which is the most part of a seed. You have the little embryo forming in there, and then you have the seed coat forming on the outside of it. That's sexual reproduction.